11 Days of Remembrance, Day 4. Chapter 4, Away from the Mines. During his time at the mines, Larry developed a very close relationship with a chap named Roy Strickland. During the few days they had off, Roy and Larry used to knock around together. Roy's dad was the main superintendent at the Lakeshore Mine in Kirtland Lake, Ontario. Larry noticed some young men wearing RCAF uniforms coming to the mine to visit relatives. When he had a chance to talk to them, they told Larry they were, were air gunners and would be going across the pond soon. One day Roy said, "I'd like to see a little more of the world than these bloody mine tailings. I think I had head down to Toronto and join the Air Force." "Sounds like one hell of a fine idea. I think I'll go with you," Larry replied. Signing up for the RCAF was like signing up for a baseball team in those days. Sure, everyone knew there was a war going on in Europe, but the consequences of going overseas to fight in it never crossed the young men's minds. They it arose war as an advantage venture. It was something to be excited about, not knowing to be feared. They were going to serve their country. That's all they knew when they arrived in Toronto, or the Big Smoke, as it was often called. Larry and Roy located the recruiting center on Bay Street. Young men crowded the halls of the building. It was obvious to Larry that a lot of them had the same idea. Larry filled out all the standard documents and went through the mandatory medical exam. All went well until the examining doctor tested Larry's eyes and found that he had non-binocular vision in his left eye. Larry was born with no muscular control in that eye, but he was never aware of it. Up until that point, it never presented itself as a problem. He could play sports, read, and accomplish most things anyone else could do. In fact, Larry's overall hand and eye coordination was reasonably well above average, and his night vision was better than most. Aside from his eye, Larry was in excellent physical condition. His body was lean and hardened by all those years of farm and the brutal work in the gold mines. Even so, the medical examiner in Toronto would not pass him, and Larry was forced to find another way into the Air Force. Returning home to Nova Scotia, Larry presented himself at the House recruiting station. He was turned down again, and though devastated, Larry was determined to keep trying. As at least last resort, he located the officer in charge of recruiting for the Halifax area, Squadron Leader Chapman. Prior to the war, Chapman had been the principal of the Nova Scotia Agriculture College in Truro. Larry explained that if he closed his left eye, he was a crack shot. To prove it, Larry dragged Chapman outside the office to demonstrate his shooting skill by firing a few kitchen materials with his single-shot .22 caliber rifle. Looking at the officer in the eye, Larry said with conversation, "I want to serve as an air gunner. I think the most important position for an air gunner is the ability to shoot well, and I can do that." No one will ever know that Chapman decided to admit Larry into the RCF as an air gunner. He had dealt with hundreds of young men in his career as an educator, and perhaps he knew that determination and desire were key factors to succeed, as importantly as skill and ability. Maybe he saw something in Larry that wasn't his mind. He will it maybe is just to figure out the paperwork required when you failed someone's medical. Either way, that was the first step in a process that led to Larry becoming Canada's top gunner ace. Chapter 5. Joining the service. The telegram Larry received on July 22nd, 1942 tells all he was accepted. Nonetheless, Larry remained in suspense until he received his orders to report to the RCF base in Lancy, Quebec, where he traveled arrangement in the pit of his stomach. There was a feeling that Larry tried to tell himself was examined in a dream-like state. Larry said goodbye to Jack, his brother-in-law, hugging him tightly. Look after yourself, boy, Jack, usually calm voice began to catch as they prayed. Larry saw a tear in the strong man's eyes. He put his hand on Jack's shoulder, but was unavailable to meet his eyes. You too, he said, staring at the ground. Turning from Jack, Larry walked over to the loading platform. His steps were slow and heavy as the verdict was suddenly in slow motion. He turned to give his brother-in-law one last wave as he watched him drive off. Looking across the tracks at the road that led home, Larry began drinking in the sight, trying to commit every inch of detail to memory. He closed his eyes and let the feeling of the late afternoon sun warm his face. He took a deep breath and vowed he would always remember the smell of fresh cut grass, the feeling of wide open space of the country connecting Larry. Let the small talk of those around him fade until he felt completely alone. This was his home, and whatever he had to come in the future, he wanted to make sure he remembered it. When Larry stepped down from the train and Lance, a non-commissioned officer NCO, told the man to board the trucks that would transport them to the base. As Larry bent down to pick up his battered suitcase, he heard a familiar voice booming over the platform. Well, the war has taken its toll when they have to accept blind socket from Nova Scotia. Larry spun up. The Roy Strickland was standing in front of him with a silly grin on his face, collapsing his body and hand. Uh, Larry joked, "Oh God, look, have you driving trucks? I was afraid they would make you an air gunner. With you can't even hit the board side of a barn with a pitchfork." The pair turned and walked towards the bus and the suitcases over their shoulders. Aren't it the truth, my friend? But this is not temporary and all. The wisdom they decided to train me as an air gunner, feeling a lot more at ease that he had found a familiar face. Larry began to relax. Oh, Roy, you are a big, strong boy, and when worse comes to worse, you can throw your guns at a night fighter. When the pair boarded the bus, they would take them to their new temporary home. Upon arrival, the troops were assigned to individual barracks. They were given just enough time to unload their next to their bunks, and from there they went to the supply station to outfit them from skin out. Carry the new attire. They were all headed through the medical station to receive a series of injections for everything from typhoid to leprosy. Larry was standing behind a big fellow who stood about 5 foot. His arms were so big they didn't even touch the sides when he walked. There's a saying, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Well, it was certainly true for this man. When the first needle pinched his arm, he fainted and collapsed on the floor like a stack of potatoes. Sinking the walls around him, he wasn't the only one to suffer a less than agreeable reaction to the needles. Later that night, a man named Mike McKinnon had an allergic reaction. His arm swelled up to twice its normal size. If it weren't for Larry cutting the t-shirt off him, he probably would have never gotten it off. Basic training proved to be quite the test for most of the men. The days were long, starting bright and early at 0600 hours. The squadron hit Parade Square about half an hour after the military wake-up call and spent most of the day there. Most viewed it as torture, and some went so far as hiding in closets to avoid the entire thing. Suffering the heat, the early morning rises, and the boring drill routines, the young men formed all over the country began to form a strong bond. They ate together, slept together, and complained about their superior officers together. They were creating friendships that would last a lifetime. That probably was that they didn't anticipate how brief those lifetimes would be. Among Larry's new friends were Ken Sundell, Dennis Ernest, Don Thomas, Mike McKinnon, and another character whose mother played a Jersey Manning trick on him by naming him Christopher Columbus. Later, Larry's next posting brought him to St. Hubert, Quebec, near Montreal. The base was mostly used as a senior flight training school where student pilots earned their wings. The base was a new one, equipped with 80 Harvard trainers as well as several Tiger Moths. Even though the base was relatively new, it was expanding. Work was never in short supply, and everyone seemed to be moving at a hectic pace. One hot and humid day, Larry was approached by Sergeant Mayor Cross. Without even so much as a greeting, Sergeant Major looked Larry up and down and said, "We got to paint the planes." He said it as Larry was Picasso himself. The answer is to players. The fact that Larry had never picked up a paintbrush in his life obviously hadn't crossed the sergeant major's mind. Explaining that he was not an artist only served to encourage Cross looking at through he may explode at any given moment. He is stressed down the exploding into a sea of red. Well, if you not a painter, why don't you get the hell out of here and find someone who is? Larry was given the first mission as a member of the RCF field. Find Sergeant Major Cross, someone to paint planes or suffer his wrath, vowing if it came down to it, he would paint the damn planes himself. Larry went off and searched for an artist. He eventually found one who hailed from Sudbury, Ontario. By the end of the first day, he had found another Cross. He provided Larry with an additional 8 men to aid him in trapping and repairing the aircraft. With the 11 men working together, they managed to get through two aircrafts in a single day. Their results were superb, and even Sergeant Major Cross had different finding to Crane approaching Larry at the end of the first day. Sergeant Major Cross looked up the aircraft using his hand to shield his eyes from the glare. You know the old man's the planes need to be done by tomorrow. Not a problem, sir. We'll find it in, Larry replied. Hmm. Considering who he was talking to, Larry looked at the comet planes as Cross turned and began to walk towards the hangar. Felt like there was no harm in asking. I don't want to seem presumptuous, sir, but I have the weekend off and I would like to go to Boston. The problem is the return train arrives back a few hours after my leave expires. There was a moment of silence as Cross considered his proposition. Larry's high hopes seemed out to fail. No doubt he was going to get one hell of a tongue lashing for even suggesting the idea. He began to curse himself for bringing it up. I don't have a problem with that, Sullivan. Just tell the guys down at headquarters that I said it was okay. If they give you any grief, tell them to come to talk to me. And with that, Cross turned his back and came because again to the side of the open hangar door. Excited about the good fortune, Larry could help but think. Mission accomplished. In Boston, Larry had Buddy Mike McKinnon met with Larry. Dorothy, both men had checks to cash, so Dorothy brought them to her bank and introduced them to her bank manager. Upon the two young men, the bank manager asked them if they enjoyed watching hockey. Seeing their faces light up, he smiled and handed them a piece of paper with an address on it, telling them they could get tickets there. The address on the paper led them to the building in the downtown area. Climbing the stairs to a large door with a frosted window, the boys looked at each other. Boston was known for its high crime rate, and they were worried about what they had gotten themselves into. With the reach at the top of the stairs, Mike shrugged and knocked. Where